You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. Today is episode 300.
Can you believe it? 300 episodes of the Toxic Mold Podcast.
Yeah, we started this, I can't remember for sure. Was it 2019, 2018?
A long time.
It's been a while. And for our listeners that have been listening the whole time, thank you. We've pretty consistently released one episode every week. There's been a few times that we put it on hold for a few weeks, and then I can't remember what else has happened. But for the most part, it's been every week. So
that's true.
Pretty good. Today's topic is something we do every year. We do it in the spring and the fall, but it's the spring checklist, which from what I've heard and the feedback I get from a lot of our listeners and clients, they seem to think it's pretty helpful.
Absolutely. And it's good that we talk about it every year, just so it brings it up for people every year.
Yeah. And, we always talk about documentation and routine inspections. This isn't like a certified home inspection or mold inspection, but this is just things our listeners can do. They can have their husbands do it. They can pay their handyman to do it. You can hire an inspector. If you hire an inspector, they're hopefully going to know everything on this list. But I guess my point is that this is more of a DIY type of inspection. Should people still do the spring checklist if they've just moved into a home they bought? I mean, if they've just had a home inspection to buy the home, should they still do this? Probably. And the only reason I say that is I don't know the qualifications or the quality of their home inspection. Okay. I've come across inspectors that are great. I've come across inspectors that are terrible. Some been doing it for 30 years and they were terrible. Some just were brand new. So I guess to answer that, you should go through this. So I'll start going through it. If there's questions you have that come up, just stop me, because more or less I'm just going to go through like what I would typically do. I'm not going to go through everything. But anyhow, we always start with the exterior. Here's why. For our listeners, I like to start with the outside. So, I get up on the roof first, but if there's missing shingles in a section, I know when I'm up in the attic, I need to pay a lot of attention in that area. If the grading and drainage is flat, let's say it has a full basement, maybe there's a section of grading and drainage that has settled and it's negative drainage. I know on that wall when I'm inside, I need to be paying attention to that for moisture intrusion. So for our listeners, that's why I always start with the exterior. So how long typically do you think it takes to do this spring checklist? And weather-wise, when is a good time weather-wise for people to... Because I know in Wyoming, it's still snowing in March. Yeah. So what do you suggest for those? Time? Well, I mean, if you can't do the exterior or if it's raining, you just do that at another date.
Okay.
Of course, there's always pros and cons to everything, but the good thing about if it's raining or snowing, but more rain, for our listeners, go up in your attic while it's raining, and that's usually when you're going to spot any leaks. So once again, like Wyoming, sometimes it's snowing in July, but if there's inclement weather, just do the outside at a different time.
So you did. So it takes what? So if the weather outside
I didn't answer that part. Yeah, how long it takes.
But I'm just thinking, if the weather outside's not great, still do the interior, and it's actually a benefit if it's raining, because you could go and look and see if anything is dripping on the inside.
Well, yeah, in the attic and crawl spaces, you can get a better viewpoint if it's wet. If something's leaking, you'll see the active leak. Or you should.
And then how much time should people set aside to do this?
Well, I think for our listeners, they're not going to do like I would and take hours, but I would say at least an hour, maybe hour and a half.
Okay.
2 hours. It just depends. I mean, if you're in a 5,000 square foot home, that's going to take a lot longer than a 1,500 square foot home. But once again, these are our listeners that are not qualified termite inspectors or pest inspectors or home inspectors or mold inspectors. They're not certified, so I wouldn't expect them to do what I would do. But to go back to where we start on the roof, for our listeners, you want to be looking for missing shingles, any debris up on the roof. If you have trees around your house, make sure there's no broken limbs or anything like that. You want to check all your rain gutters. And if it is raining, you shouldn't be on your roof. But if it's a light rain or a recent rain, there should not be any water sitting in the gutters, meaning check and make sure they're flowing or sloped properly to the downspout. If you have trees around your property, you should have screens on the gutters. If you don't, probably be a good idea to get those installed. On the roof, like I call them roof jacks, but it's where the plumbing vents come out of the roof itself. So you have the shingles, the plumbing vent, the roof jack, the pipe comes out of. Check all that stuff. If you have a chimney up there, check and make sure all the flashing looks good. Just make sure everything looks good up on the roof. Make sense?
It does make total sense. So a lot of it is just you start at the roof, you check the gutters, the downspouts, you're looking for standing water. Then what do you do next?
You're going to get obviously back down on the ground, and that's when we start checking all the hard surfaces. So hard surfaces are your concrete driveway, foundation, sidewalks, brick, hard surfaces, masonry, however you want to term it. But you want to check all of those for any cracks.
Are cracks normal in sidewalks and driveways?
Yeah, absolutely. But those cracks should be sealed.
Okay.
And what's causing the cracks, I just mentioned it about our driveway, where it's starting to, the cracks are exposed. You can see they're pulling away a little bit. They need to be sealed so that more moisture doesn't keep going down in there. The more moisture that goes into those cracks, the more it's going to expand when it freezes, the more settling is going to happen. It's just over time, it's going to cause a lot of problems.
Okay.
So for our listeners, unless you want to replace your entire driveway or sidewalks, which most municipalities, you're responsible for the sidewalk, I would make sure all those cracks are sealed. You can get a Sikaflex, which is a silicone that's for concrete, has more elasticity to it than normal silicone. You don't have to do it every year. You could probably seal it once every 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
So, makes sense?
It does.
Now, when we are talking about hard surfaces like your wall coverings, if it's brick, stuff like that, those cracks, it is normal to see cracks, but they should be smaller than 1/8 of an inch in width.
Okay.
So once again, those should be sealed too, but keep an eye on those. For the most part, when we see cracking, we should see the same size and type of cracking that's fairly consistent. They're going to come and go, like inside of a house in the sheetrock. Our listeners are probably like, yeah, there's this crack that always shows up all summer, goes away in the winter, or vice versa. It shows up in the winter, goes away in the summer. Those are just from your soils expanding and contracting. But if those cracks are getting bigger, that tells us there's a moisture problem. So obviously the point of our spring checklist is to do an overall inspection, but to make sure we don't have mold concerns. But to finish up the outside, check all the exterior finish. So that's your siding, whatever type of siding you have, doors, windows, check the corners, check your electrical outlets, make sure they have weatherproof covers. Your lights should look fine. I'm sure you would notice if you turn your lights on and they don't work. The main power box where it attaches to the house, there's a conduit that comes out of it. Look underneath where that conduit's attached to the bottom of the box and make sure there's no gap there. Because if the ground is settling, it's going to start pulling that conduit away, which eventually is going to pull your electrical lines out of the main breaker, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. So yeah, make sure that stuff looks good. We kind of mentioned the grading and drainage, but make sure all the rain gutter downspouts have extensions on them. Make sure the grading itself, if a home's finished and it has, let's say gravel in the flower beds or whatever, you're not going to be able to tell what the hard surface below it looks like or the subgrade, but make sure it slopes away from the home.
Okay.
So, and then plumbing, we normally in the spring, we typically are going to see pipes, outdoor spigots that froze up all winter. When you go to turn them on in the spring, that's normally when we're going to see them leak. For our listeners, turn that faucet on, and then let's say if you have a full basement, wherever that faucet is, come inside the house and check that area after the faucet's been running for a while, make sure nothing's leaking. So that, obviously if you have sprinkler systems, you want to check all that stuff, but that covers the outside. Any questions on the outside?
No.
Okay. Then the next spot we jump into is the crawl space and the attic. If you don't have a crawl space, obviously you don't have to do that. Attic, make sure you have sufficient access. And for our listeners, if you're not comfortable, don't go up there. But on the other hand, if you're not comfortable walking around the attic, get a good flashlight and just do an inspection from the access.
Okay.
And what you're going to be looking for up there is the same thing we're going to be looking for when we go inside the home, but we want to be looking for pest intrusion. So you would see mice droppings. We don't really have raccoons that get in attics around here, but...
Do snakes go in attics?
Not typically, no. Now in a crawl space, absolutely.
Okay.
That's always been, when I was doing inspections, home inspections all the time, that was always my worst fear. Being crawling around in a crawl space and coming across a snake would not be a fun experience. But once again, back up into the attic, pest intrusion. We're looking for mice droppings, rabbit droppings, any sort of pests. I already mentioned water stains. You're looking for visible mold. Check your insulation. Make sure it's not discolored. Insulation turns kind of blackish or a different color when it gets wet. Doesn't necessarily mean it's mold, but check, like in the attic, check your subroof. So you'll be looking up, you'll see the subroof, the attic side of it. Make sure there's no mold or water stains. Make sure also in a crawl space or an attic that all exhaust fans that are running through there, the ductwork, make sure they go to the exterior.
Okay.
Because if they don't, it'll elevate the humidity, which will lead to obviously mold concerns. If you have a crawl space, make sure it has a vapor barrier. Make sure there's proper ventilation, whether it's a crawl space or an attic. We've talked about this before in our other episodes. Humidity gauges that are Bluetooth to your phone or to a display in the living area. That's really important. So for our listeners that are wondering, they're like, what should the humidity be? Should always be below 60.
Okay.
And I would say 55% is probably the cutoff. Once we get over, 55, that's telling me we're right there on that edge. Because mold needs 60%.
Okay.
So, any questions in the attic or crawl space?
No, that's pretty straightforward.
Okay. So then on the interior, what I always recommend is, a good flashlight. We use different types of lights. Obviously, we have infrared cameras. You can use UV lights, all sorts of different types of flashlights, but a good LED flashlight, that's obviously what we use. Check the walls, floors, everything for water stains and cracking. All the plumbing components, make sure you're checking that. So sinks, dishwashers, washing machines, make sure all of those are good. I covered the cracks on the outside, but I'll just remind our listeners, 1/8 of an inch in width, which is pretty narrow. That should be the most that it's cracked. Once again, you may see cracks that come and go depending on the seasons or the moisture, humidity in the air. So it's is what it is. But we're looking for mold, mainly behind, entertainment centers, things like that. Check all the flooring for water damage. Once again, we're looking for pest infestations. Look under the sinks after you're running the water. Make sure nothing's leaking. Do a tub or shower pan test. We talked about a client. We did some mold remediation last year, and remember it was from a faulty shower pan.
Yep.
Was $15-20 million home. Not even I think 10 years old was the age.
Wow.
And at the end of the day, it was a defective shower pan, and it caused a lot of water damage. So for our listeners that don't understand that, if you have a walk-in shower, the floor of it's the shower pan. Same principle with a tub, but you can buy on Amazon, you can buy a drain plug, or you can just close the drain. And if it's only a shower, just fill the shower up. Of course, it has to have a curb on the shower, but fill it up and put a few inches of water in there. Just mark it with a piece of tape. Don't mark it with a Sharpie. Let it sit there, depending, what we're testing for or what we think's the problem. Usually we'll leave it filled up the entire time we're there for an inspection. So for our listeners, just, fill it up and then check it the next day. Make sure though you don't fill it up at night and then let it sit all night, because if it's leaking, that's not a good thing. So I guess what I'm telling our listeners is fill it up, earlier in the day and then check it before you go to bed. And if that water level has dropped, just drain it.
Okay.
And at that point, we know there's a leak somewhere. And it could be in the liner, could be in the curb, could be if there's a seat in the shower, could be in the grout. There's a ton of reasons that it could be a problem. But for our listeners, that's a big deal.
Okay.
You don't want to deal with that kind of mold issue. So, yeah, this is quite the list, so I better hurry and start wrapping up, huh? As far as the mechanical, make sure you check your furnace, your AC. You should have your ducts cleaned every other year. I always recommend having a professional inspect them. I would do that every fall. Some people do it in the spring and the fall, but I would have it inspected by a professional, and they'll usually do it for $150. It's not that much.
Okay.
So we already addressed cleaning the HVAC system. Make sure you change your filters for the return air filter. That should be changed every 3 months. So if you're only doing it for the spring and fall, you're going way too long. That should be done every 3 months.
Okay.
And also, if you change it every 3 months and they're really dirty, instead of waiting for 12 weeks, bump it to 10. And, depending on where you live or how efficient your furnace is, you might have to change them more often than you would think you should. But on the other hand, if you feel like, as a listener, if you feel like you're having to change them too often, like every couple of weeks, you should get a professional out there to assess it, put a borescope down the ductwork, make sure everything's intact. When it comes to the indoor air quality, you should have testing done. I wouldn't recommend professional testing every year. I mean, I would, but I wouldn't expect our listeners to do that. You can test for mycotoxins, which you can buy the EMA test right on our website. You should test for radon every other year. Radon should be below 4 picocurie per hour on average. In January, we did an episode about radon, so for our listeners, you can go back and listen to that. I think we did 2, didn't we?
I think so.
I'm pretty sure we did. But anyhow, they can go listen to that. But radon is an important thing to address. Talk to the occupants of your home about VOCs. So maybe you have a teenage son that just discovered that the Axe body spray is the coolest thing since sliced bread. Maybe talk to them about using that much spray because it's VOCs. When it comes to VOCs, we've done episodes on that too. We mentioned a pest inspection, termite inspection. I would always recommend having those done probably every year, every other year. They're not very expensive, so I'd always recommend that. When it comes to the safety side of your home, verify your smoke detectors are operational and change the batteries. Make sure all your handrails, guardrails on your stairs are sturdy and operational. Make sure you have an operational fire extinguisher in the home, and then also review your fire escape with all the occupants in the home. So I think I covered everything, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, that's everything. It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of talking for me, so that's why we have you on the podcast, so I don't have to do it all. But anyhow, it's a pretty thorough checklist that we go through. Our listeners know we do this every spring and every fall, so.
Yeah, so what's your call to action for people?
If you think you have mold concerns in your home, go buy an EMA kit.
Okay.
Go to our website. I'll put a link in the description.
Perfect.
And for our listeners that don't understand that, EMA is a environmental mold and mycotoxin assessment. It's 2 different tests. So it's a mold species, which is similar to an ERMI, but then on top of that, it's an actual mycotoxin test. So a lot of information. We do ours through Real Time Lab. They're a lab that I think they got bought out by US Biotech. Can't remember if it was last year or when it was, but they do the urine mycotoxin testing. So that's why I prefer Real-Time Lab. They have a lot of research and white papers. They have videos. They have all sorts of stuff. You can buy the kit directly from the lab, but that doesn't include my analysis of it. If you buy it through our website, it's included.
Awesome.
So we appreciate all you listeners. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.